Welcome to the Sidewalk Weekly podcast, a show for people who are big on cities but short on time. I'm Vanessa Quirk. Eric, did you see this video of a parrot singing along to Stairway to Heaven?
You know, I was really impressed with its stage presence, actually. It was dancing, it was using its beak to kind of shimmy up and down. Really impressive move.
It had like spatial awareness of its cage too. Like it would kind of go to the top to do the more like belty stuff and down at the bottom to do the little whistling. It was a very conscientious little parrot.
I mean, you know its name, right?
No, what's the parrot's name?
Jimmy Cage. No, you don't like that one? What about Robert Plant? I could keep going. I can keep going all day. But I guess we'll get into the show. All right, city lovers. Welcome to the Sidewalk Weekly. I'm Eric Jaffe. We'll spend the next 20 minutes or so discussing the biggest stories from the urban tech world this week, and we'll chat with Olga Stella about an innovative project in Detroit. When time's up on a segment, you'll hear our little bicycle bell. This week, our top stories look at the uncertain future of urban retail, the unequal distribution of COVID testing, and whether or not restaurants should start setting up tables in the parking lot.
All right, let's dig into these stories.
All right, so the top read of the week was a story from The Atlantic by Derek Thompson. He's writing about how the pandemic will change American retail, and more specifically, urban retail, forever. Vanessa, you've done a lot of work on this. You did a whole episode on the future of retail for City of the Future. What's in store for us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this was a really excellent piece from Derek Thompson, a long read, but a good read. And just to step back and kind of explain where retail was before the pandemic, right? It was already struggling, to be frank, right? And there are a lot of reasons for that. Most people kind of immediately understand that the emergence of Amazon and e-commerce was a factor hurting retail stores, but it wasn't the only reason. We kind of dive into those in the City of the Future episode. So among those are rising rents. There was a lot of movement of venture capital coming into retail and kind of forcing a lot of expansion that some stores couldn't support. Those were some of the reasons. But now, fast forward to the pandemic, right? And all of these lockdown orders are keeping people from going outside to shop or do anything, really. Yeah. And so, of course, there's this big shift to online shopping. And a lot of stores are feeling the hit. COVID is essentially exacerbating what was already a difficult situation. And now we're already seeing vacancies. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot more, unfortunately.
Right. Thompson points out a survey done of several thousand small businesses across the U.S. And only 30% said they would expect to survive a lockdown that lasted 4 months. And here we are, at least in New York already. We're already into month 3.
Right. And Thompson comes to certain conclusions that are pretty interesting. He thinks that we are going to see chains thrive even more than they were before, which was a lot. At least in New York City, it's very common to see big banks, big pharmacies, and it's a lot harder for the little businesses to stay open. So he thinks that we're going to see that trend accelerate because larger companies and chains, they just have more money to weather the storm here. They have better access to bank loans. They can afford more worker protections, things like that. He does mention that he thinks restaurants are in for a pretty intense disruption, perhaps the worst of all. And he quotes a Harvard Business School retail expert who says, restaurants will have to do these 3 R's: reduce, relocate, and repurpose. So reduce means like shut down some stores. Relocate means leave more expensive downtowns. And repurpose is probably going to mean shifting to either all or at least partial online delivery, right? So, I mean, no matter what happens, we are going to be seeing a lot of changes happening on the ground floor of our cities, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you can't leave this story without the really strong impression that we are in for major changes in the urban retail landscape. And they're not great changes. Retailers, they're just super vulnerable right now. And to your point, they already were a little vulnerable. So, I mean, this speaks a lot to the need for flexibility in retail on the ground floor in cities. We've looked at that a couple different ways at Sidewalk Labs. We've looked at flexible lease terms. So if you don't know, kind of the standard lease, if you're on the ground floor of a building in cities, is a 10-year lease. That's right. A lot of money and a long time horizon for a business. And some just can't afford that. So looking into ways for short-term leases, maybe even monthly leases, so that a business can kind of get a quick start and maybe scale up from there.
Even leases that allow for your rent to actually be commensurate to what you're earning. That's certain models that we've seen, actually.
Yep. And shared tenant spaces too.
Right.
Flexible physical spaces, I think, is another part of this, right? Typically a ground floor space is very rigid, right? Only a certain type of retail outfit can fit into the physical space. So making those spaces a little more flexible, say with flexible wall panels, which also reduces the costs of renovation. These are things that can kind of help cities adapt to these really tough times.
Mm-hmm. And we should note that even though in the immediate term, Thompson's pretty cynical about what's going to happen with retail, and I think with good reason, he is rather optimistic when he looks long-term out into the future. He feels like over time, as stores close, retail spaces will actually get more affordable. Hopefully those rents will start coming down. And he's hopeful that you'll see artists and creatives and other kind of local businesses finally be able to come back into neighborhoods because it'll be affordable again. And if that happens, then streets really could get more exciting, less mainstream kind of cookie cutter chain, and potentially more diverse. So let's hope that that's the future that we do see.
You know, we should support small businesses as much as we can now to make sure that future is possible.
All right, let's move on to our next story. This one is also kind of restaurant themed, coming from Henry Grabar in Slate. He writes that the best way to save restaurants could actually be to let them just spill out onto the streets and into their parking lots. Eric, are you ready to kind of like park and dine here?
Yes, as you can imagine, I'm not the biggest fan of eating outdoors, but this is the future we might be facing here. And the reason is, you know, social distancing, it's very difficult in a crowded restaurants. In fact, a lot of the charm of restaurants is that you're kind of sitting on top of each other. And there are some states and cities, they're starting to let restaurants reopen, but at a very reduced capacity. So like Texas, I think Henry Grabar writes, lets restaurants, if they have 25% capacity, open. That's a really small margin. The margins in the food industry are already tight. It might not be enough to help them survive. So he's saying, why not put some tables in the parking lots right next to a restaurant? Or if you're in the city, close down part of the streets. You get a little more space. You can serve more total diners.
Mm-hmm. And the secondary benefit that he also points out is that, you know, the virus is transmitted much more easily indoors, it seems. So outdoor seating not only helps with distancing, but it also hopefully prevents the virus from circulating around inside the restaurant.
Yeah, that's true. And this isn't totally hypothetical here. You know, This week in Vilnius, which is the capital of Lithuania, there was 18 public spaces that were opened up for restaurants specifically so that they could put their tables 6 feet apart. People could come and eat and patronize the restaurants. And more than 160 restaurant vendors have already applied for those spaces. And, you know, we might have to get creative with it in some of our denser urban areas. But even in a place like Manhattan, you've got, you know, almost a third of all space is street space. So this space does exist. We just have to find it and use it.
Right. I mean, I do like outdoor dining, so this seems like a fun and creative solution for someone like me.
What about when the bugs steal your food, though?
Bugs are clearly something that has to be worked out.
I guess we have bigger problems right now.
Yeah. But one thing I was thinking about, though, that could be problematic is rain. As I was reading, I was thinking, you know, like I wish that the building raincoat were ready to deploy.
The building raincoat.
For those unfamiliar, the building raincoat is a building innovation that our public realm team has been thinking about, prototyping. And basically, the idea is that it would be a deployable canopy that attaches to your building, and it would have sensors so it could sense the weather, and it would open up automatically maybe like right before it starts to rain or something. And in that situation, you could be dining happily and the raincoat deploys, you could just keep on eating. And I feel like that would be a very useful innovation to have in our city streets, especially if we're all going to be outside and dining al fresco from now on.
That would be really useful right now. I could see that for sure. It's much better than kind of dining while holding an umbrella.
Yeah, for sure. Very awkward. Unless it's a pizza in one hand and an umbrella in the other. That's kind of the only
Exactly.
one.
I mean, I guess you could do it. You know, we've thought also about kind of street design has a role here, right? We've thought a lot about different ways to design streets to encourage more vibrancy and use by pedestrians. We have 4 street types in our designs. 2 of them are for fast-moving traffic and for transit vehicles, but 2 of them are meant intentionally for slower traffic and slower travelers and active street life. So we call one of them a laneway. It's only for pedestrians. And the idea is that shops and restaurants, they can spill out into the street very easily. And I think we'll start to see this idea really take shape now. You know, I mean, we're hearing about cities closing down streets so pedestrians can have more safe space, but you could extend this idea to active street life as well.
And the nice thing about the laneway, too, is that it's really conscientiously thinking about if a street is for people, not for cars, what does it look like? And I think you can experiment with landscaping, with street furniture. I think there's a lot of more creativity you can do when you take cars out of the equation, right? Of course, it will have to be comfortable to eat, right? I mean, we've talked about rain, bugs.
Yes.
like there are things that it can be unexpected. And Henry even says, it is going to be weird. It was always going to be weird, even if you were inside and it was only like you and two other people, right? So weirdness should not be the factor to take out this option. And I think it's actually a pretty creative and a good one, to be honest.
Right. It's all weird. Let's at least support restaurants.
Yes, exactly.
All right. Our third and final story this week comes from Vox, and it's actually another type of retail parking lot story, though a lot more troubling. Comes from Aaron Ross Coleman, who's writing, there's testing centers across the U.S. that have been set up in the parking lots of major retailers. But there's a big problem with this system because these retailers are not always accessible to the lower income and minority communities who we know have been really hit hardest by COVID. So, Vanessa, what is happening here?
Yeah, I mean, this is a troubling story. It's similar to stories we've been reading before. Of course, this one focuses a bit more on Chicago, but we've been reading about Detroit and Milwaukee. In all of these cities, unfortunately, people of color have been hit much harder by COVID deaths than the rest of the demographics in the city, and often disproportionately to the share of the population that they represent, right? So in Chicago, for example, they make up more than half of the COVID deaths, but they only make up 30% of the population, right? In other words, Black Chicago residents are dying at 4 times the rate of white residents, which is shocking, right? And to top it all off, which is really what this piece is all about, these folks are the ones getting tested at lower rates.
Yeah, and one of the other statistics from this piece that stuck out to me was, across the whole state of Illinois, beyond Chicago, Black residents make up 37% of COVID deaths, but they've only received 13% of the state's testing, according to the CDC. So, there's a lot of different inequities here.
Definitely. And this piece is talking about an initiative that rolled out recently from the White House. And the idea was to set up testing sites across the U.S. They've set up 63 so far. Not sure if that's enough or too little, but that's kind of besides the point right now. The point that this article focuses in on is that only 8 of these 63 testing sites are in predominantly Black neighborhoods. So obviously these sites are not really identifying the most vulnerable populations and serving them, right? And so the way that these testing sites were selected was through partnership with private retailers, right? So CVS or a Walmart, retailers like that. But we know that private retailers tend to go where the money is,
the big
right?
chains, yeah.
They don't necessarily set up in poor or lower income communities. And what I thought was interesting about this piece is the history that has set up this inequity in the first place, right? So Aaron Ross Coleman talks to a Rutgers professor, Naoya Kwete, who points out that there's, historical reasons for this. There's a history of segregation. It's resulted in wealthier, whiter suburban neighborhoods where the big retailers tend to go, and poorer, less resourced neighborhoods where many people of color live today. And in this case, that has very immediate implications for members of the Black community, right? So Kwate notes in the piece, if you're on the South Side or in a predominantly Black suburb, you have to go a really long way. You're driving on the expressway for at least half an hour, paying tolls to get there. It is nowhere close to where you are. Like, this is a huge issue of access.
It really is. And it reveals a couple other problems that I felt in reading the piece that were pretty clear. The first being that, our testing apparatus in the U.S. at least still is not data-driven, weeks and weeks into this terrible pandemic that's upending life as we know it, we still are not choosing where we put testing sites based on who needs it the most, right? We know that COVID has comorbidities with obesity, with hypertension, with other pre-existing conditions that afflict lower-income populations more than others. We also know from previous pandemics that these populations, because of the health disparities that already exist in those communities, they get hit harder, right? So you cannot choose the testing sites randomly. They need to be driven by the data saying who is the most vulnerable. That is not happening. That needs to change. The other is this reliance on cars that we keep seeing when it comes to testing. Basically, the way testing has been set up in the US, there is a fee on testing even if it's free. And that fee is that you have to own a car to get a test, more or less, right? And people in urban centers, they don't all own cars. Sometimes they can't afford it. Sometimes they actually prefer the other available options. But you need a car to drive to a Walmart parking lot to get a test. But that is not the way it should be. You know, these clinics should actually go into the communities that need them most.
Definitely. And I think in the piece, they bring up the idea of, you know, what if we had set up these testing facilities in post office parking lots, for example, which are purposely and equitably dispersed throughout communities, right? So, I mean, that's one way that you could have gone about it. But, you know, barring that, I think more mobile solutions are going to be really important. You know, getting pop-up testing facilities to kind of come in to different locations, to neighborhoods that are hardest hit, and provide that support in a more kind of flexible, modular kind of way.
Yeah, we're seeing some of it. Hopefully we see more of it very soon.
Definitely. That is it for the top stories. As always, you can find the links to these stories in the podcast episode notes. In our next segment, we are going to talk with Olga Stella of Design Core Detroit, and we're going to have a chat about how innovative leasing has helped revive a downtown landmark there. Back in a sec. We are now joined by Olga Stella. She is the host of the Detroit City of Design podcast, which you should all check out. And she's also the executive director of a nonprofit called Design Core Detroit. This week, she wrote a really great article for Brookings about a project that has leveraged innovative and affordable leasing to attract creative sector entrepreneurs to an underutilized city landmark. So, Olga, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Olga, really glad you could join us. Can you describe this setting for us around this building for listeners who maybe aren't familiar with Detroit, and maybe talk about how the building started this turnaround?
The Fisher Building is an iconic building in the New Center neighborhood of Detroit, which is in the northern part of our greater downtown. So about 3 miles from the core business district. And in 2015, the building was acquired by The Platform, which is a mission-driven real estate development company. The building is known as Detroit's largest art object. Just really beautiful, but very traditional. The real story now of the building is how The Platform has leveraged Detroit's creatives to start to recast the building and to, reactivate it, reanimate it in this part of the downtown that hasn't seen as much investment as the central business district. This floor was traditionally doctors and dentist offices and other small offices. Modern office buildings, they're like big, wide open, empty floor plates that a single user can come and carve up to their own uses. And this floor plate just really didn't allow for that. But given the large windows and the natural light, what the platform saw was an opportunity for small creative companies, freelancers, artists, other kinds of creatives to co-locate in these small suites. And really took, it was an experiment, took a chance on beginning a leasing program that would really target those kinds of users for the space.
Let's talk a bit more about that leasing program. As I follow your piece, the rent structure around that is really what made this revitalization possible. So how was the platform able to offer more affordable rents in this space?
Yeah, I think part of what they recognized was that they weren't going to find that single user to lease the floor out at the typical rent. And so they did need to make some minimal investment to prepare the spaces. They've recouped all of the investments that they made through the rent by getting more volume into those spaces and by being a little bit more creative. The other piece that they really looked at, it wasn't just the rent. It was also insurance requirements and other kinds of maintenance and the kinds of fees that office users end up paying to have the privilege of being in a building like the Fisher. And the platform really worked hard to adjust those things to meet the needs of this group of potential tenants. And what they found was that people were interested. They were looking for spaces. Where they had been going were a lot of the co-working spaces, these small office spaces in the Fisher, put them in proximity to potential new customers and created the kind of working environment they were looking for at that affordable price point.
There are some really great stats coming out of this project so far. I mean, high occupancy rates, really great revenue growth, diversity of tenants. So can you talk about how the platform achieved a diversity in tenant mix and how that benefited the project overall?
Yeah, they really were very much focused on that diversity. So 50% of the tenants are women-owned businesses, 50% are businesses where the owner or the person is a Detroit city resident. 50% are people of color, and 40% under the age of 30. So young, vibrant, diverse. We work with the larger design community. We offer a small business network, and the platform, has really been an active partner of ours for the last several years. And so they were trying to put themselves in the places where they would find these tenants and begin to recruit them. And we're really intentional about recruiting them.
Olga, last one, and we'll let you go here. Obviously, this project started before the COVID outbreak. Detroit's been hit hard. So many cities have been hit hard. Now that many entrepreneurs are struggling to pay their rents, do you think we'll see this type of flexible leasing model play an even greater role in cities?
The main thing that really jumps out for me from the platform's case study is the unexpected business benefit of those collisions. It was about creative people who might not have been in close proximity to each other and to other more traditional users, having that opportunity for creative collisions and creating new business opportunities out of that. And so I think the next step is really going to be about how do we allow for those kinds of creative collisions in a safe way. And they may be as simple as staggered work times, face masks in the office, visible hand sanitizer and cleaning products, physical changes in terms of workspaces. I mean, this is exactly what designers and creatives do, is they solve problems that are bound by challenging constraints. And so I think over the next 6 to 9 months, we'll slowly start to figure out what that path is, and that there are ways, both to create safe spaces, safe office spaces that protect public health, but still encourage being together, that we have to find ways to be together.
We appreciate your time, Olga.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for reaching out.
It is now time for our final segment, The Last Smile. This is the segment where we set aside the depressing news of the week and we focus on something happy for a minute. Eric, what was making you smile this week?
The piece that really made me smile this week was in City Lab. It was by Ariel Aberg-Reiger. Boy, I hope I got that right, Ariel. But the piece was about how to discover the history of your neighborhood without leaving home. Ariel goes on a journey back in time, just using the internet, maybe a little music, maybe some snacks. If I'm going to do it this way, there's probably some scotch involved. She focuses on the history of her hometown in Ardmore, Buffalo, and goes through old newspapers, old maps, city archives, pulls out all these nice little details about the neighborhood, didn't know them before, dives deep, goes on I guess we can call it a mental vacation since a physical vacation, that's not possible at this time.
Yeah, I thought this was a really fun story, and she digs up some really fun tidbits about her own house and her own block. I think somebody got robbed at one point in her house, and he woke up when the robber took something from under their pillow. So it's just fun little colorful anecdotes that you can tell.
It's amazing what you can find about your own city just with the internet. All right, Vanessa, what made you smile this week?
So I really enjoyed this article in the New York Times from Michael Kimmelman, who is their architecture critic. Generally a fan of Michael Kimmelman's work, but this article is a little bit different. This was a virtual tour. So he's walking around New York City with different architects and engineers and having conversations about the buildings around them. For this tour, he was with Guy Nordenson, a structural engineer of some renown. He's worked for really interesting folks like sculptor Isamu Noguchi and Buckminster Fuller. So really interesting guy. And they start at the Seagram building, which is, one of Mies van der Rohe's most famous buildings. They go to Black Rock by Eero Saarinen, Philip Johnson's AT&T building, and then they end up at 432 Park Avenue, which, not one of my favorite buildings in the city. It's, this Raphael Vignoli building with really bizarre gaps. So now I know why those gaps are there. Learned a lot about engineering of these buildings and the wind forces. So a really fun article that's worth taking a little break to discover these secrets of these skyscrapers.
Another form of kind of a local vacation. In this case, I guess they take it for you, but it's still very entertaining. All right, time is up, folks. Thank you for joining us this week.
If you want to read the stories that we discussed today and many more, then you should sign up for the Sidewalk Weekly newsletter at sidewalklabs.com.
We should note that the views expressed in the Sidewalk Weekly don't necessarily reflect Sidewalk's company position.
And if you think we're missing a perspective, then let us know. Send an email or voice memo to podcast@sidewalklabs.com, and we may just talk about it in a future episode.
The Sidewalk Weekly is produced by Vanessa and me. Vanessa does the editing. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions, and our art is by the great Tim Cow. We'll see you next time.